They said the Miriam Hale Public Library would close quietly on a Tuesday with a cardboard sign and a polite apology. Nobody would read. The town council had already voted. Low circulation, no budget, no future. Most folks in Greywater Harbour didn't argue. The cannery had closed, the ferry ran twice a week at best, and people learned to search for answers on their phones while they waited for signal to crawl across the bay. But Miriam Hale, 79, cardiganed, precise, the kind of woman who stacked hope like books and dusted it daily, refused to let the last light on Harbour Lane go out without a fight. She'd been 16 when she first pushed open the oak doors and breathed in the scent of paper, glue and rain-damp wool. The library saved her then. It gave her a place to be smart without apology, to be curious without permission. Over 6 decades she shelved, catalogued, tutored and listened. She taught sailors to email their grandkids from the public computer, walked shy children to the shelf where stories would love them back, and sat with widows who needed quiet more than conversation. When arthritis took the strength from her fingers, she learned voice dictation. When funding cuts took staff, she learned to mop and smile at the same time. When the council's letter came, stiff and final, she made tea, sat at the big wooden desk, and said aloud to no one in particular, "Not yet." On the last Monday, before the scheduled closure, she arrived before dawn with a thermos, a sandwich, and a stubborn plan that made her feel 16 again. She unlocked the side door, flicked on lamps one by one, and listened to the soft hum that old buildings make when they're glad you came back. In the basement, behind a bookcase that had not moved since the Nixon years, she had noticed a seam in the wall. Old coastal places are full of seams, between tide and town, between good night and good luck, between a building's purpose and its next brave guess. She pried gently with a butter knife and a prayer. The panel slid free with the sigh of a secret relieved to be found. Inside was a narrow room she could have sworn did not exist on the blueprints. A shelf, a table, a tin lamp, and 3 wooden boxes wrapped in oilskin and tied with fraying twine. On top lay a brass key and a note in spidery script for the keeper who understands that memory is a kind of lighthouse. E. Miriam stood very still and let joy rise like heat from pavement after rain. She carried the boxes upstairs and set them on the children's table, because that felt right. She filled the kettle and, while it sang, untied the twine with the same reverence she'd once used to unlace her wedding dress. Inside were letters, clippings, ship logs, marginalia, a ledger with sea salt pressed into its spine, and photographs so silvered they seemed to glow of their own accord. The oldest letter was dated 1904 and addressed simply to the library, Greywater Harbour. It began, "If the sea keeps secrets, the library keeps the sea." She read until her tea went cold. There were notes from fishermen at sea sending poems to be kept safe until they returned, from women who ran boarding houses and night schools, from a black teacher who sailed north in 1939 to escape a law that refused to see him and found in Greywater a town that mostly did, from children who wrote in careful pencil that the library smelled like courage. There were recipes scribbled on tide charts, family trees, with little waves drawn beside every name that drowned, and a long, fierce letter from a group of teenage girls demanding more science books and fewer rules about ladylike silence. There were ship manifests, ration lists, and a ledger in which each borrowed book had a tiny checkmark when returned and a tiny heart when kept past due because someone needed it longer. Miriam brushed each page clean as a nurse washes a newborn. By noon, she had called 3 people. Mr. Reyes, the high school history teacher, who ran a small-town podcast that no one admitted listening to, but everyone did. Nora, the editor of the stubborn weekly paper, who still set type on an antique machine because respect is a habit. And Luce, her neighbor, a tattoo artist and single mother, whose daughter Alma had practically grown up in the children's room. "Come," Miriam said. "Bring curiosity. Maybe gloves." They came. They read. They cried the sort of tears that make your throat ache pleasantly. Mr. Reyes recorded an interview of Miriam reading the 1904 letter. Nora took photographs with the care of someone photographing a loved one's hand. Alma, who was 17 and always hungry for a task worth her seriousness, started a spreadsheet and, with the solemnity of a priest, labelled a box, "Storm Letters." That night, Luce posted a thread of images and quotes with the caption, "Our library isn't a building, it's our memory. Don't sell the memory." It travelled farther than anyone expected. Former residents shared their own stories. The GED earned at a shared table. The winter they kept warm, reading aloud. When the power failed, the librarian, who taught a fisherman to read his son his text and sent him home crying happy. By morning, a historian offered to help archive. By lunch, the Maritime Museum pledged to fund preservation. By dinner, Miriam's voicemail contained 3 reporters' numbers and 1 message from a soft voice who said, "My grandmother wrote one of those letters. I still have the bonnet she wore when she learned to read." The council scheduled a listening session for Friday, the bureaucratic phrase for a meeting they planned to ignore. Miriam spent Tuesday through Thursday preparing not speeches, but invitations. She put a sign on the door, "All hands, bring a memory, bring a kid, bring a song." She asked Jonah, the teen who shelved manga and beatboxed when nervous, to run sound. She asked Big Tom, the retired longshoreman with a banjo, to tune. She baked cinnamon bread and set out mugs. She polished the brass plaque that said 1964 and placed beside it the brass key labelled "Sconces," because the panel in the basement also connected to a circuit that ran the old wall lamps. Lamps no one had seen lit in decades. Friday night, the library swelled like a lung. People came with photo albums, notebooks, quilts stitched with ship names. The council sat at a folding table with legal pads arranged like shields. Miriam began, not at the podium, but cross-legged on the rug among the front row of children. "Once," she said, in a voice that had read bedtime to 3 generations, "this library lived behind a needle shop. When the storm of 1933 took the roof, the women of Greywater patched it before the men were home. When the war came, the library sent letters to boys at sea and girls in factories. When the flood rose, the shelves rose. When loss came, we made chairs for it." She held up the 1904 letter and read. The room leaned closer, as if to share breath. One by one, the town spoke. A fisherman read a note from his great-grandfather to a librarian in 1918. "Keep this for my grandson. I don't know his name yet, but tell him I believed in his hands." A teenager in a leather jacket performed a spoken-word piece about insomnia and the comfort of aisles arranged by numbers you could trust. Mr. Reyes played a clip from his podcast, Alma helping her mother study for a certification exam, turning algebra into tattoos and currents into equations. Laughter became tears, became something steadier than either. Then the lights went out. A storm rolled over the harbour and took the grid with it. Phones raised like little stars, then dropped as the cell tower sulked in weather like this. In the dark, someone cursed, someone giggled. A child whispered, "It smells like old books and rain." Without thinking, Miriam moved. She took the brass key from the table, walked toward the back wall by instinct, and slid the key into the panel no one but she knew existed. She turned once. The sconces along the walls flared to honeyed life, soft and warm, like a memory saying, "I'm still here." Gasps turned into a sound that might have been gratitude deciding to live in the room permanently. Miriam lifted a letter to the light and read, "For nights when storms come in 2 kinds, weather and men, let this room be a harbour." For a while, the library was exactly that. Children curled on rugs, neighbours poured tea for strangers. Alma and her friends led a whispery chorus of an old sea shanty whose rhythm steadied everyone's breathing. In that light, the faces in the photographs looked as if they might speak. When the power returned, the council took a break to confer. The president came back with the tired certainty of a man who thinks money is a full stop. "We appreciate the passion," he said, "but the budget is the budget." He reached for the gavel. No one moved to leave, not in anger, something more patient than that. Miriam stood again, feeling her knees argue and her heart agree. "You are not closing a building," she said. "You are closing a practice, the practice of belonging." She lifted the ledger with salt in its spine. "This is wealth. You can't count it, but it counts us." A silence more persuasive than applause followed. The next morning, the library opened at 6, not on the schedule, on principle. Miriam propped the doors, rolled carts onto the sidewalk, and turned the day into a festival disguised as a workday. Jonah set up a mic and read book first lines as if DJing a sunrise. Big Tom played under the awning. A barber gave free haircuts, a baker sold pastries at cost and gave away day-old bread to anyone who promised to read aloud to someone they loved for 15 minutes. Loose-inked tiny anchor tattoos with the word "read" woven into the rope. 3 grandmothers went first. The children's table became a shipbuilding yard where cereal boxes turned to brigs, taped to wind. By noon, a woman from the state archives arrived with boxes and white gloves and a look of glad disbelief. "This is a collection," she said, hovering her hands over the letters like a priest blessing a congregation. "You've been sitting on a cathedral." She offered conservation, scanning, and a grant application, written that afternoon in the corner near biographies. A local credit union pledged matching funds for every donation under $20. The ferry captain announced that anyone carrying a library card would ride free that weekend. Someone started a chant. Miriam blushed the color of a ripe peach and kept working. The council called an emergency session for Sunday, another phrase that meant the town had surprised them and they hoped to catch up. This time the meeting was at the library because no one would go elsewhere. The president began again with numbers. Miriam countered with names. He spoke of cost centers. She spoke of centers that cost nothing and save everything. A child's right to belong to a sentence, a widow's claim on quiet, a sailor's folded poem that steadied his hands at sea. When he said, "We have no legal mechanism for your feelings," Alma stood. "If you won't fund it," she said, voice steady, respectful, brave, "sign it over to us. We'll run it as a cooperative until you remember what you forgot." The credit union's lawyer offered pro bono paperwork. The archivist texted a legislator she used to date and received, "If they form a trust, the state can match." By sunset, the council voted not to close, and not only to fund, but to place the library in trust under a community board composed of elders, teens, educators, and anyone who showed up to carry chairs when it rained. The room burst into a laughter that sounded like relief setting down a heavy box. Someone pulled the fire alarm by accident because joy is clumsy. Everyone went outside and turned the sidewalk into a waltz. In the weeks that followed, Greywater Harbour changed quietly and then all at once. A new sign went up, Greywater Harbour Library and Commons. Beneath, in smaller letters chosen by consensus and stubbornness, Keepers of Light. The basement became a studio where old fishermen recorded weather lore and lullabies. The children's room sprouted a maker table where girls in soccer jerseys soldered wires into small stars that glowed when you whispered your name. The reading garden traded weeds for rosemary, nasturtiums, and a bench plaque that read, "Sit, we kept this seat for you." Miriam moved more slowly. She forgot titles and remembered bigger things instead. She kept a small notebook in her cardigan with instructions for loving a place. Open early on foggy days. Water the spider plant when its leaves start to pray. Leave one lamp in the front window for the tired ones. Put the kettle on before anyone asks. Sometimes she napped in the chair where her late husband Arthur had once sat during chemo and read comic books out loud to make her laugh. In dreams, he still turned pages with the dignity of a man who believed time could be persuaded by tenderness. One rainy evening, she found a final envelope tucked into the ledger box's false bottom. The ink was petaled black, but legible. It was from E, the mystery keeper who had left the key. "If you are reading this," it said, "you kept your promise to a building and to the people who fit inside it. When storms come, of water or men, turn on the sconces and sing. A library is a lighthouse that fits in the hand." Miriam pressed the letter to her chest and felt the building answer like a cat leaning into a palm. Winter returned with its old habits. The grid flickered, the sconces held. The ferry broke, the library organized carpools. A boy turned 17 and cried in front of new fiction because no one had ever spelled his name right on a card before. A woman read her own story aloud, without apologizing for her accent. A retired welder built a ramp so graceful people took pictures of it. A child fell asleep on beanbags while her mother wrote an application that would move them toward a life with less weather inside it. On the first anniversary of the night the lights went out and came on, the town gathered at dusk. They strung lanterns along Harbour Lane and tucked slips of paper with the names of their teachers into the brick small seams like seeds. When the lamps dimmed at once, the room inhaled. In the soft dark, Miriam's voice rose, steady as tide. "If the sea keeps secrets, the library keeps the sea." The lamps brightened as if in agreement. After, Alma walked Miriam home. The night smelled like kelp, cinnamon bread and new paint. "You did it," Alma said. "We did it," Miriam corrected, then added, "Keep doing it even when I forget how." Alma nodded, as if to nail the promise into the air. In late winter, Miriam died in her sleep. On her bedside table lay the ledger, the key, and a lemon cookie wrapped in wax paper because love is practical. The town placed her ashes in the reading garden beneath rosemary, already dreaming of June. They did not put up a statue, they put up hours and kept them. They did not engrave her name in stone. They wrote it every morning under today. Helpers and children argued sweetly over who got to write the years rounded. Grief became a shelf you dust and smile at. The library grew like a carefully told story. A marine biologist identified shells for kids who had only ever identified Wi-Fi networks. A novelist moved back to finish a book because he needed the sound of real people turning pages. The ferry ran daily again. The cannery reopened as a cooperative teaching clean aquaculture. Tourists came for the lighthouse across the bay and stayed because a librarian with a tide pool tattoo handed them a map she'd drawn herself that said, "Best benches for crying, good kind." On the 5th anniversary, Alma, now 19, hair streaked blue, and job title Programs Coordinator, pinned slightly crooked, stood on a step stool and spoke about what Miriam had given them. Not nostalgia, not rules, but a way to practice future by practicing care. She read from the little notebook Miriam kept, "Open early on foggy days." She looked up and smiled. "We did." That night, when Alma closed and hung the key on its hook, she felt a shift in the air, as if someone had just left or just arrived. She stood very still and whispered, "Thank you." The sconce by the door flickered once, sharply like a wink. They once said the library would close quietly on a Tuesday. Instead, it learned to sing louder on the days when silence tried to swallow it. They said there was no money. Instead, they built wealth whose interest is paid in belonging. They said old women were sweet but impractical. Instead, a woman with stiff knees and a key opened a door wide enough for a town to walk through together. Years from now, when a storm rolls in and the power dips as if the sky had a thought and then forgot it, someone will reach for the panel without looking, and the sconces will bloom, and a child who has never known the library without light will ask why the lamps glow so warm. Someone will answer, "Because once a librarian planted a lighthouse in a room and asked us to tend it. If you visit, you might miss the miracle at first. You will smell paper and lemon and salt. You will hear the small chorus of chairs being moved for someone new. You will notice the plants have names. The pencils are always sharp, and the lost and found contains a mitten, a postcard, and a sentence a person was brave enough to start before they had to run outside to keep living it. If you stay until closing, the last lamp will remain in the front window. It is not a mistake. It is a signal. And somewhere in the margins, in a letter written a century ago by a hand that knew storms and wanted company, you will find a line that explains everything. Keepers of light are ordinary until the night arrives. That is the library's secret and the town's. Miriam Hale did not defeat darkness. She taught everyone how to carry dawn. The rest, as the ledger says in neat black ink, is circulation.